And now, for something special, we're flying far away to Australia, to Sydney, to welcome our next speaker. This is Dr. Sally Gainsbury, the Director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Centre of the University in Sydney. So she will be presenting remotely. Unfortunately, we would love to have her here in person. The topic is enhancing voluntary take-up of effective, safer gambling tools by at-risk customers. Dr. Gainsbury, I hope you can hear us. Probably also you can see us. Well, good evening to Australia. It's a pleasure to have you here, at least remotely. We'd love to have you here in person, of course. And in your country, you are 8 hours ahead. I think now it's time to go out for a lovely dinner. You spent the time with us. We appreciate it. We thank you for that. And the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. I hope that the invitation may stand. I will be able to join you another year. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I'm the Director of the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic. I'm the Professor in School of Psychology, and I'm the Principal Investigator of the Technology Addiction Team within the Brain and Mind Centre, again at the University of Sydney. So I'm in the position to be able to share my expertise from a clinical point of view as a trained clinical psychologist. However, I have been leading a research team working in the field of gambling studies for around 20 years now. So today what I'm going to be talking about is some of our research I've been conducting looking at safer gambling tools. But what I'd like to do is take you through a journey to reconceptualize what I mean by safer gambling. Oh, sorry. Pardon me as I just get the slides up. There we go. So we have already had some presentations today, and I'm mindful of what the speakers have said before me, and you already know a lot about safer gambling. And what I'm going to present about today is a reminder about the changes that have taken place in safer gambling and this concept that we've moved from responsible gambling and player protection to safer gambling, and trying to position it in a way that players are not being told what to do or restricted, but rather we're trying to empower customers and encourage voluntary take-up of tools that are really in their best interests and using an evidence base that's world-leading. So what I want you to think about is yourself for a moment, or you can think about someone you know to make it a little bit easier. But what I want you to think about is whether you always make the right choices at the right point in time. Even if your long-term choices you're pretty sure on of where you want to be, what are the aspects of your life that make it difficult for you to make those optimal decisions? And then to think about someone else. Everyone has different optimal decisions, different things they're striving towards, and we're vulnerable to problematic thinking at different times. Gambling is no different. We need to be mindful that although someone may gamble one way at one point, there are other factors that change on a daily, a weekly, a monthly, and a yearly basis. To think about safer gambling is not the same at all time, and no longer can we presume that customers are always going to gamble in the same manner, that if we check in once, that will be sufficient, that the same gambler will be in the same category of play or the category of risk as they were at one point in time. So, for example, if they set a limit when they first signed up to an account or walked into a casino, if that limit is going to be appropriate for them in an ongoing basis. Because we know that problem gambling is not a static condition. We know that people cycle between levels of risk, that people might gamble moderately or not at all. They do go through periods in their life where they may gamble in a more risky manner or may gamble in a problematic way. But people cycle between that. And what we want to think about is how we can disrupt this journey, because the good thing about recognizing that problem gambling is not an inherent characteristic of the person or a static condition means that we can start to think about how can we respond at the right time and in the right way to prevent the shift between recreational to at risk, and then from at risk to problematic, and to minimise relapses. This is what my research has been looking at, is moving away from this concept of having an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and a couple of signs or fences in the venue per se, and how we can start to shift that thinking towards reconceptualizing, keeping people at a recreational, non-harmful level. And this is what I mean by reconceptualizing safer gambling, is moving away from this concept of 1%. We've heard this, and it's quite static across countries. Around 1% of the population are classified as problematic gamblers. But if we look at regular gamblers, people who gamble monthly, that number jumps pretty substantially. These are data from Australian prevalence surveys, and they show that amongst people who gamble monthly, the people classified as problematic players go from 1% all the way up to around 22%. So we're starting to think about a much broader population than just the 1% of people at a general population level who do experience harm. And that includes thinking about the 6 to 10 other people who experience harm for each individual with gambling problems. So what I want to talk about today is focusing on shifting away from just the help seekers, which are an incredibly important group. However, we need to also think about how we can get into early intervention and prevention, because we haven't historically focused very much on these areas, particularly this area of early intervention. When someone is at risk, how can we disrupt that journey towards problematic play and shift them back into the green zone of having lower risk and even reduced harms? So we need to think then, what do we know? Because unfortunately, the evidence base is not overly strong when it comes to harm minimisation tools. There have been a number of reviews recently conducted that have really had to conclude that the evidence base is quite poor, and we have very few really methodologically robust studies to guide us, particularly given how dynamic the changing nature of how gambling is provided. We now have online gambling sites in very different ways. We gamble at a different level in different ways, and the generation are quite different now from who previous things might have been tested on. So when we start to think about this dynamic nature, we really can undermine the current evidence base and start to unpick our current harm minimisation tools based on best practice or best opinion at the time. We do know that very few people voluntarily engage with harm minimisation tools. So when we look at what's currently out there, we know that people don't tend to understand them well. Often they're not perceived as relevant, and they're often even internally described as help for gambling problems. So something like a deposit limit, which is relevant for all people who gamble, is described in the help section or in the treatment section or the gambling problems section of a website or on a website of a venue. This is something that came out from one of the studies I did with my colleagues, looking at why people who are members of or customers of an online wagering site would or would not use harm minimisation tools. People typically didn't see them as relevant. They saw them as only for people who have a gambling problem, and I'm in control of my gambling, so I don't need to set a deposit limit. So we need to start to unpack this concept of increasing not only our own conceptualization of safer gambling tools, but how customers also think about these. And what I want to talk to you briefly today, and it's just a brief presentation, but there's a lot more behind it, is how we can use behavioral science to start enhancing safer gambling and to build up a strong evidence base so that we can start to look at world-leading best practice and evaluate and inform practices over time. Now, the first step is actually to take a step back, and this is something that we often rush through to think about designing. Let's put something in place. Let's get it legislated. Let's trial it first off. But we need to actually take a step back and think about defining and really conceptualizing the problem, to think about what are you actually trying to achieve? Who is the audience group you want to reach? Are you trying to reach people who have severe problems? Are you trying to reach people who don't have any problems? Or are you trying to reach somewhere in the middle? And if so, where exactly? We need to start thinking about what level of harm is acceptable in terms of having people engage with an intervention. We also need to think about, what are you trying to do? What is the behaviour you want to encourage or discourage? This is critically important, because one of the reasons we don't have a good evidence base is the questions haven't been asked. There is plenty of research at a population level, and there is a lot of policies that have been put in place. But it's very difficult to work out if any of these policies are successful. And one of the reasons is because that often hasn't been defined in any way. That a policy is put in place to reduce gambling harm, but unless we look at just measuring the population of people who have gambling harms, it's very difficult to know, are we trying to reduce the number of people who are gambling at risky levels? What exactly are we trying to do? And if we don't know that, how is it going to be successful, and how are we going to know if it's successful or not? Automatic risk detection is something that's already been spoken about today. This is this idea that we need to move away from just observing behaviour or relying on venue staff to look at people, what they're exhibiting and what they're saying, to start to look at inferred behaviour. If we can use automated risk detection, we can start to use behavioural algorithms to detect risky gambling at a level that's far more accurate than the human eye and visible identification. And it can also be logged over time. So this is something through account-based play. So obviously online accounts are very helpful. Also through cashless play or carded play within a venue is certainly an area that Australia is moving towards having. And being able to then combine operator insights, people making declarations, with inferred behaviour to build up a profile of someone over time so we can be more accurate in how we can intervene with someone. But it's also about changing the design. So this is a graph based on customer behavioural data from one of the wagering operators in Australia. We have had several major wagering operators share data with us. Obviously, it's de-identified. We can see here the low take-up rate of people who are willing to voluntarily set a monthly limit. When you can see that steep rise in the graph, that is the month where instead of having to drill down and set a responsible deposit limit on play, the government mandated policy changed to be opt-out. So all new customers to this gambling site had to interact with a deposit limit and specifically say, no, I don't want to set one. And you can see just that shift in how a limit is, a safer gambling tool is positioned to a player, dramatically changed how many players engaged with the tool. This is some more figures from the similar study. We looked at around 32,000 online wagering customers, and we found that setting deposit limits were effective in reducing gambling, that people shifted in terms of their average daily wager, the variation, the betting intensity, all signals of risky gambling. And this occurred after we sent them a message. However, this message at the time was universal. We sent the same message out to all the customers at all the same period in time. So we did see a shift. More people did take up the deposit limits than previously, but it was just our first go to see if this works. What we need to do now is think about how can we make this more specific, because interventions need to come at the right time. It's no good randomly sending people messages. We need to think about, should they get a message after a big loss or after a big win? Or should they get a message when they first sign up? Or should they wait until the second or third time they've actually used an online wagering account, when they're actually more familiar with the account and what they want to bet and how they are betting? That might be more impactful in terms of setting the right limit. And what should the message say? Because we are not the same person repeated. We need to think about personalising language and targeting to a specific audience. Again, to think about, what are we trying to achieve? Are we simply trying to increase awareness of tools? Are we encouraging people to reflect on their own behaviour? Are we trying to specifically prompt an action? Do we want people to, at that point in time, set a limit or check their activity statement? We need to use simple language, and we need to be positive. We need to empower customers. See this as engagement. This is just part of the customer experience. We're going to reach out. We're going to use these sorts of messaging, and it's going to be relevant to you. And we need to prompt people in a way that's helpful, using behavioural science to avoid heuristics. For example, when we're encouraging people to set a deposit limit, it shouldn't have an anchor of, £200 as the high limit to start thinking about people. It should ideally have no anchors whatsoever. So people have to actually think about what's appropriate for me for a deposit limit. And if there are any anchors at all, they should be very low amounts, $5, $10. Again, this isn't about constraining choice, but it's about enhancing harm reduction and encouraging people to act in a way that's going to be beneficial for them. Similarly, activity statements is something that have recently been mandated within Australia. All online wagering operators have to send activity statements to all active customers each month, and each activity statement has to look exactly the same. It's the same format. You can see the design here is, again, working with behavioural science principles. It's using red text to draw the attention to the net outcome. It's comparing behaviour over time. It's aiming to increase informed choice, to increase awareness of spend, particularly with of value. It's relevant to your own spend over time. But what it could do is actually prompt that next step to give people some indication. Are you spending more than typical? Are you spending more than others? Should you set a deposit limit? Something else to help them along these roads of making decisions. And finally, with timeouts or self-exclusions. Again, these have demonstrated effectiveness. More self-exclusions. There's very limited research on timeouts, but we know that that is a useful step for people who are not ready or needing to commit to permanent self-exclusion. However, it can't be that people have to find the self-exclusion form somewhere on a website, print it out, fill it out, email it off or mail it off and wait for it to be actioned. These need to be very easy to implement, simple for people and encouraged to do so. So these are the main principles that I want you to reflect about. And again, this is a brief presentation and an overview of the types of areas that I'm working in. But I want everyone to start thinking about not just what is the tool, but how do we encourage people to use it? How do we want to make it easy, attractive, social, and timely for individuals? These are some of the key principles of behavioural science that we can start to implement to enhance the safer gambling tools that we offer. And I really want to end just by encouraging everyone to think about collaboration. No one can do this alone. Academics and treatment providers, we can't come up with this by ourselves. We need to work with industry to understand the priorities, to get access to customer data, to test out evaluations and to have funding for research, as well as with government. And then we can work with industry and government to inform best practice, to do evaluations and to guide refinements. This isn't something that's a competition. Safer gambling is very much an area for collaboration. And again, I've had a brief presentation today, so I apologise if that's a lot crammed into a short period of time. But I'd really like to encourage all of you to think about sustainability and what you're trying to achieve, what's relevant for the industry, what's relevant for government, and what's relevant for customers, how we can redesign systems to think about how we can be proactive in identifying and minimising gambling harms and really collaborating and working together. I want to thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to be involved. Again, I'm very sorry. I would love to be there in person, and I hope I get an opportunity at a later date. I'm very happy to answer, if there's time now, a few questions, and please do reach out and contact me or just say hello after this presentation. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gainsbury. This is your round of applause. I can assure you the room was silent. Everybody was concentrated and listening to your presentation. It was excellent. Thank you very much. Probably there is a question. Can we see if we have some questions and if you want to take them? No questions. So you were so comprehensively educating the audience here that no questions are left. This means the lovely, sunny Australian evening is yours. Thank you very much and see you in person for the next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.